Well, I think we're here. This is August 16th, 2020, and this is Random Thoughts from County Antrim. And I'm your host, David McDonnell. This is my half hour-ish of telling some stories, some yarns, some historical tidbits, random thoughts, and whatever it is piques my fancy for my half-hour podcast, which I'm doing all through the pandemic. Now, today I want to talk to you about something that's fascinating to me, and it's to me because I'm fascinated with history. But it is also quite relevant today, and I think you can see, after you hear the story, how far we've progressed in some respects in the last 100 years. But you'll also see that in many, many respects, we haven't progressed an iota in 100 years. So here's the story, and it starts in Haskell County, Kansas, in January of 1918. And I'm going to tell you about what started there and what kind of progressed elsewhere in the 13, 14, 15 months thereafter. Now, Haskell County, it's in the southwest part of Kansas. That's not too far from the Colorado border or the Oklahoma border. There aren't any real towns to speak of there. It's very rural. It's cattle country. Farmers raise pigs there as well. It also happens to be a flyway for migratory birds, particularly the sandhill cranes and mallard ducks fly over Haskell County in large numbers twice a year in their migration patterns. Now, in January of 1918, people in Haskell County started to get sick. And was a local doctor. His name was Loring Miner. And he's probably typical of small-town doctors in the era. He treated everybody for anything, and he probably delivered most of the babies in Haskell County. Made house calls, which is something unheard of nowadays. And when people got sick and he started treating them, he realized quite quickly that this was not at all normal. He wrote to a paper, actually, and he sent it to the United States Public Health Service. And he warned them of a new and possibly apparently quite vicious virus. It produced flu-like symptoms, but with a greater intensity. And I'll quote you one line from his report. It says it produces violent headaches and body aches, high fever, and non-productive cough, and it passes through the body quite quickly and sometimes fatally, and it affects, in his words, the most robust of people. Now, he called that la grippe. Grippe is the French word for flu, and was not uncommon for medical professionals in that era to refer to flu-like symptoms as la grippe. Now, the report was actually the very first report of this new type of virus or flu anywhere in the world in that first month of January 1918. Now, Dr. Miner's report was totally ignored, totally forgotten about, and only recently rediscovered. It was discovered in the year 2000, over 80 years later, by pandemic researchers. And we do know a little bit more now than we did then about how viruses get started and how they spread. A virus itself was not even discovered as a separate cause of illness until 1898. And the word virus means poison in Latin. And thinking about what a virus is and what it does has changed quite a bit in the 120 years now that the virus has been discovered. But it appears that a virus is not a living organism. It's a molecule. It's a particle that cannot live by itself. But when it connects with a living cell, it produces copies of itself. And the host cell can be a plant, mammal, bird, almost any species. And often the host species, sometimes they get sick, but often as not, they don't. And the problem is when a virus somehow jumps from one species to another, and then it mutates and can be quite deadly to the new host species. And that's likely what happened in Haskell County, Kansas. A virus in a migratory bird or in cattle or in a pig jumped to another species, it mutated and it jumped again and ended up infecting humans. And the mutated virus was more than most people in Haskell County could deal with. Now it's possible, although we will never know, that the folks in Haskell County, as difficult as it was for them, the virus may not have left Haskell County. It's a very rural county. There were less than 1,000 people living in that county in 1918. It's still only 4,000 or so today. And they're spread out, and they were more spread out then. They were living in, many were living in sod houses. You should know a sod house from Little House on the Prairie. Very few trees in the Great Plains. And people, 19th century homesteaders, cut sod out of the ground, stacked them up in a rectangular shape, and boom, you have your house. And there were still people living in sod houses in Haskell County in 1918. And there were a few travelers who were from Haskell. And as catastrophic as it was for people there, rural people, by definition, are socially distant. Now, Dr. Miner may have needed some help, but maybe the virus would not have spread. But there was something else going on in the world at the time. And that something else was World War I. Now, they didn't number the world wars then. They didn't know there was going to be more than one. In Germany, it was called Weltkrieg, which means World War. The French called it the Grande Guerre, the Great War, which is what the English called it. The Americans referred to it as the European War until we got into it, and then Americans generally referred to it as the World War. But that was going on at the same time that people in Haskell County were getting sick. Now, the U.S. entered the war in 1917. The war started in 1914, but the U.S. entered in 1917. And when the U.S. entered the war, there were about 130,000 soldiers in the United States Army. Now, by the time the war was over, there was close to 5 million soldiers in the Army and in the other branches of the United States military. Now, that meant that an awful lot of people, a lot of men, had to be trained and processed by the Army in a short period of time before they could be sent off to war in France. And so in addition to the established military bases that were scattered across the country, the Army set up training camps, 16 in all across the country. Now, one of these was Camp Funston in Kansas, in the northeast part of the state. And it trained at one time, I guess about 50,000 soldiers went through Camp Funston during the course of the war. And of course, and they took in soldiers from not only Kansas, but from all over the region who were enlisted or drafted into the Army, would come to Camp Funston before going elsewhere. Now, certainly young men from Haskell County who enlisted or were drafted were sent to Camp Funston. And guess what happened? Soldiers at Camp Funston started to get sick. And by the 1st of March, within a few weeks, there's about 1,100 soldiers who were admitted to hospital, the base hospital. And there are thousands more who were sick and confined to barracks. Now, the soldiers who were not sick, or those who recovered, were sent east to other Army posts and eventually to port cities for being shipped across the Atlantic to France. And before they boarded, they were stationed at different army posts. They received different training. And of course, they commingled with soldiers from other parts of the country. And they commingled with civilians in the course of their transport from Camp Funston to the East Coast. And an awful lot of soldiers and civilians became sick. Now, although the death toll at the time was not extensive, it wasn't extremely high yet, but an awful lot of people, soldiers and civilians in the United States, became sick. Now, the soldiers, again, those that weren't sick or those that recovered from being sick, were put aboard ship, sent across the Atlantic. They landed in France. Once in France, they commingled with French soldiers and British soldiers who were our allies, and were in contact with French civilians. They were also in contact with the colonial troops. The British Empire and the French Empire had colonies all over the world, and colonial troops were in France as allies to the French and the British. Most of these were from Africa or Asia, and not to mention the allies that came from Canada and Australia and New Zealand. All over the world were in France to fight the war. Now, awful lot of them, one by one or thousands by thousands, became sick. And it didn't cause a huge problem. It was more of an inconvenience to military planners than it was catastrophic. And the sickness that they came down with was usually called the 3-day fever. And soldiers were pulled out of the trenches, sent behind the lines, and when they recovered, they were sent back into the trenches. The French army reported in May of 1918 that they were pulling out about 2,000 soldiers a day due to the 3-day fever. Now note that timeline. January 1918 was the first reported illness in Haskell County, Kansas. And in May of 1918, just a few months later, American, British, and French soldiers are getting sick by the thousands. Again, it wasn't a big concern. The war went on. There were a few fatalities. 6 soldiers recovered generally, and then went back to war. Now then came the second wave. The infections slowed down in the late spring of 1918 and in the early summer of 1918. But they came back like a tsunami in September of 1918. In September, October, November of 1918 were the worst. And they were, coincidentally, the last 3 months of the war. Cases became far more common and far more fatal. The fatalities just seemed to increase by leaps and bounds. And not sure why. It may have been weather-related. And it did, though, coincide with the major offensive, the Argonne Offensive, which the American Army played a very, very significant role. And during that same 3 months period, it also spread to the German Army. How? Again, that's not really sure. We know. May have been through contact, prisoners of war, hand-to-hand combat. May have been civilians who were able to cross some of the lines and get back and forth, which introduced the virus to the German side of the line. But it spread in huge degrees from that to British, French, and German civilians. Most likely from soldiers who were granted leave and went home for a week or two before they had to come back to the front. Now, it also, during those same 3 months, grew much, much worse in the United States. And Boston was probably the first really hard-hit area. And it was not from troops coming back from France to Boston. It was troops coming from elsewhere in the United States to Boston to be shipped to France. Again, stopping at military bases along the way and meeting civilians and other soldiers from across the country on the way. So it was quite soon, this virus was all over the United States and far more fatal and violent than it was just a few months before. Now, unless you were sick or knew somebody who was sick, you probably didn't know what was going on. The United States had the Sedition Act. It was a crime for up to 20 years for uttering or printing or publishing anything which might interfere with the war effort. And that was the problem. You didn't want anybody to know. It was illegal to publish anything which suggested that America's soldiers were getting sick. That would be providing aid and comfort to the enemy. There was a committee of public information formed by President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson. And let me quote something that they printed, and I quote, "Truth and falsehood are arbitrary terms. The force of an idea lies in its inspirational value. It matters little if it's true or if it is false." Now, in this environment, public health officials played down the virus. In fact, they lied about the virus. They said it had been contained. They said there was nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. They told the public that science and scientific nursing had contained the spread. And the same thing was done in Britain, it was done in France, and it was done in Germany. There was no constant reminders about washing hands, about social distancing, or about wearing masks. There was nothing to worry about. Now, you'll see some photos today, if you look back at photos taken in 1918, which show a lot of people wearing masks. But those were generally healthcare professionals or people later on, late in 1918, which I'm going to get to shortly. It wasn't initially, and it wasn't during the second wave in the early fall of 1918. In addition, in America, there were far fewer doctors during this tsunami of virus cases in 1918. There weren't as many doctors during the tsunami as there were before or after. And that was because about half of all doctors under the age of 45 were in the Army. They'd been drafted or enlisted to serve the war effort. So there are far fewer doctors spread across the country to deal with the ailments of civilians. Now, there were some steps to halt the epidemic. It wasn't yet called a pandemic. And it wasn't called a pandemic because Americans didn't know that it was elsewhere. And there were efforts to follow. But I'll give you an example of how this played out in Philadelphia. The flu erupted in the Navy Yard in Philadelphia in late September. City health official said there were no fatalities, so there's no cause for alarm. Days later, sailors began to die. And then soon civilians began to die. And the health director simply said it was the common flu. Now, the city had planned a huge parade for September 28th, and it was to raise money for war bonds to help support the war effort. And there were doctors all over town got together, and they petitioned to the health department to please shut down this parade. But the health director refused. Reporters who were uncovering the information wrote articles about how dangerous it would be to have this large parade in the midst of this growing flu epidemic. But the newspaper editors refused to print them. Again, didn't want to run afoul of the Sedition Act. So hundreds of thousands of people in Philadelphia attended this parade. Within about 6 weeks, 12,000 Philadelphians had died from the epidemic, from the flu. Now, the war ended in November 1918. Armistice. And the virus slowed down for a time. Soldiers began to go home. But the third wave of the virus hit in January of 1919. And it continued for several months until the spring, when somehow, for some reason, it just kind of slowed down. I don't know if it ever died out. It just slowed down. Now, one of the victims of this third wave, which wasn't as severe, third wave wasn't near as severe in terms of fatalities as the second wave. But one of the victims of the third wave was probably Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. He was in France in the spring of 1919 as part of the peace talks that ended the war and the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. And he had all of the symptoms of the flu, of the virus. And it was reported that he may have had a mild stroke, or he had been under the weather, or it was too hot. But it looks like, historians are pretty sure, that he actually had the virus. Now, it's hard to say how many people died of the virus, in part because it was often attributed to something else or misdiagnosed, in part because governments tried to cover it up. It's likely more than 50 million, and maybe as many as 70 million people in the world died from this virus in 1918. Close to 500,000 Americans died from this virus. And nearly as many Germans died from the virus. And the biggest death toll came from India, as far away from Haskell, Kansas as you can imagine. And it may have been 16 million Indians died from this virus. As far more than those who died from the war itself. Now, what was this war called? Excuse me, war was called what I mentioned earlier. What was this disease called? Now, before anyone figured out what it was, before anyone could connect the dots, it was usually called, as I said, the 3-day fever, or la grippe, or sometimes simply the flu. The Japanese called it the American flu. German soldiers called it, if I can pronounce this right, Blitzkata, which is a word hard to explain or translate, but I think it means a lot of snot. The British and the French called it Flanders grippe. Now, the virus reached Spain in mid-1918. And when it did, the Spanish referred to it as the French flu, or sometimes the Naples Lady, which I think came from a song that was popular at the time. Now, the virus, when it hit Spain, it wasn't worse in Spain than it was anywhere else, although it was pretty serious. It even infected the King of Spain. The difference between Spain and some of the other countries, particularly European countries, is that Spain was neutral during the war. Its press was not subject to censorship. So the Spanish press reported extensively on the virus, where it was, what it was doing, how many deaths, how many people infected, how many people sick, the progress of the king. And it was regular news in the Spanish press. And that gave to many people in the rest of the world the impression that the virus originated there. And so this virus became known as the Spanish flu. It had nothing to do with Spain other than they were victims like everybody else. Perhaps ironic, because I'm not sure that the infected cells with the virus could even speak Spanish. But that's how a virus came to be known as the Spanish flu, and one of the most deadly pandemics the world has ever seen. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ireland and its experience with the Spanish flu. The virus infected about 800,000 people in Ireland, which is pretty high when you think about a country with about 3 or 4 million people. It's a high percentage. And about 23,000 Irish died from the virus. Now, newspapers reported the first wave in May. There were some school closings, some business closings. The business closings were not by government action. It was because all the employees of the business operation were sick or enough of them were sick where the business couldn't keep on going, so they shut their doors until they had enough healthy employees to open up again. How did it get to Ireland? Well, Ireland, you may recall at the time, was part of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And there were hundreds of thousands of Irish men who were in the British Army during the war. And the British Army, like the other combatants, had not frequent enough probably, but they had periodic leaves where soldiers could go home for a period of time. And the Irish soldiers would go home, and they would take the virus with them. Now, worries, newspapers reported about some of these incidences of infections, but they were worried about scaremongering. So, for example, the Belfast Telegraph, I'm going to quote something from them. They reported, "There is no reason for the general public to become unduly alarmed, and the rumors circulating currently in the city may be accepted with the proverbial grain of salt." Don't believe what you hear about people getting sick. Grossly exaggerated. That was their message. And by fall, the public and public officials and newspapers began to recognize this disease for what it was or what it is. And many businesses and schools closed. There were fewer public gatherings. And that persisted until till late November when the war ended. Now, when the war ended, people flocked to the streets. There were huge celebrations, parties that lasted for days and days and days. And what do you think might happen? It caused a huge spike in infections and a huge spike in deaths, all within a few weeks of the armistice, which ended the war. Now, the highest number of infections and the highest number of deaths in Ireland were in the port cities. That's where the soldiers came back to. Dublin, Belfast, Cork. It was lowest in Connaught and western regions of Ireland where there were far fewer travelers. But that was the experience of Ireland, which again was not abnormal when measured against the experiences of other parts of the world when the Spanish flu evolved and transferred all over the world. Now, I just want to end with telling you some Irish remedies. These were some of the things that they did in Ireland and they advocated doing in Ireland during the pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic. Some of these are good, some are not so good. It was strongly recommended that you wash the inside of your nose with soap and water. It was recommended that returning soldiers be quarantined and that their uniforms be disinfected before they go home. Now, that was the recommendation. It was never done. Soldiers went home, got off a boat in Belfast or Dublin or wherever and went straight to their home to visit their family. When their leave was up, got back, shipped back to France. It's recommended that you wash your floors with a disinfectant. They also sprayed the streets with disinfectant. Trams and railways were scrubbed down. They didn't do spraying of people, which they did do in Spain, with some success, they believe. Spraying people with some sort of disinfectant was done quite often in some places in the world, but not in Ireland. Some, but not all, gatherings were canceled. Different county fairs and different events were canceled, but far from all of them. Eating good food was a recommendation. I guess that's always a good recommendation. One government official recommended that you clean your teeth often. Another one, this is a public health official, recommended eating onions. I'm not sure the health benefits of eating an onion might be, but it might have helped social distancing, and maybe that's what he was after all the time. Eating porridge, something grandmothers have always encouraged, was encouraged in Ireland during the pandemic. One doctor who sounds like he could get a job in Washington today, one doctor in Dublin recommended lozenges coated with formaldehyde, because that would certainly kill the virus. The Archbishop in Ireland recommended earnest prayer. Never a bad thing. But they didn't close the churches. They did close the churches in other parts of the world, in Canada, parts of Canada, and France, and Switzerland. Churches were closed because they were large gatherings. But no, they never closed the churches in Ireland. And finally, I want to tell you about some of the grifters. The grifters of Ireland came out of the woodwork, and they produced product after product after product, each guaranteed to stop the virus. They included a mouthwash and ointments and carbonated water. For the right price, you could take that product, guaranteed, you would not get the virus. So I'm going to end the podcast with that. I'm going to leave it to you to decide. Since 1918, have we progressed much at all? That's the question. So that's it. Don't forget to visit my website, clandonald.net. Send me an email at clandonald@gmail.com. Like and share me on Facebook. Just let me know whatever's on your mind, whether it's virus related or not. And in the meantime, goodbye. I'll see you next week. Shalom.